Hello everyone, I'm Brendan Riley, and in this presentation I will describe the mating strategies used by organisms in the deep sea, which, believe it or not, is much more of a challenge than one might presume. Now, if you were to imagine it as sex with the lights out, then you may begin to understand the limitations that these critters experience. However, the sex itself is only the start of their problems, because, unlike humans, these guys actually have to find their sexual partners in the dark as well. So what is the deep sea? Well, in oceanography, the deep sea is considered to be the marine environment 1 kilometer below the surface of the ocean or sea, and it extends, in some places, as deep as 11 kilometers. So along with the great depth range, it also covers a very, very large geographical area, essentially the whole ocean. Now, there is definitely some variance in the types of ecosystems within the deep sea, but all of these areas have one thing in common, and that's that they're exposed to a negligible amount of sunlight. This means that they're cold and extremely dark. Now, when I say dark, I don't just mean the murky dark blue like what you see at the bottom of this slide. Nah. If you were a fish in the deep sea, all you would see is pitch black. This is what deep sea organisms must endure on a regular basis. So because of this environment, no photosynthesis is possible, and the lack of photosynthesis leads to a great food shortage. So as a result, very few organisms are able to successfully inhabit these vast deep sea waters. And on top of that, many of the critters that are successful in this habitat, including the deep sea fish, have often adopted a sedentary lifestyle in order to conserve energy. So, when you look at all these factors together, you can see that it's very hard for most of these animals to find mating partners. This is a major problem, because even as human beings, many of us have had points in our lives where we may complain about the so-called shortages of suitable singles in our environment. But creatures in the deep sea have it far worse. They don't have plenty of fish accounts, and because many of them are in low population density areas, they may go on for long periods of time without even being near a potential mate. However, even if two of them are lucky enough to cross paths, there's always a possibility that they may not even notice each other in the pitch blackness. So with all these obstacles in their way, how do these sexually reproducing organisms successfully mate? Well, first off, it should be noted that relatively speaking, the deep ocean is still not very well studied. Unlike the coastal environments, the deep sections of the ocean are very hard to monitor for many reasons. First off, humans are incapable of diving that deep, and even with the use of technology, it's still hard to see anything, and once again that's due to the pitch blackness. But lately research has been improving, mostly because of the development of newer technology, particularly from the use of remotely operated vehicles, which allow us to observe the deep sea without having to travel there ourselves. But overall, the observational evidence of deep sea mating is still lacking. And because of this, the mating strategies of most deep sea organisms within their natural habitat is often based mostly on speculation. But there is, however, some deep sea mating strategies that have become well documented through recent findings. One of these is known as the Bathyteris mediterraneus, and it is a type of tripod fish found deep within the Mediterranean Sea. And these fish have been identified to be simultaneous hermaphrodites, which basically means that they got the best of both worlds at the same time. But all kidding aside, this is a very useful quality to have in the deep dark ocean. The odds of finding someone to reproduce with go up a lot when you are not constrained by gender differences. So for these fish, all they need is one of their own species and they are set. Now, Fischelson and Gallel examined many of these deep sea organisms, and they found that each of them contains both a pair of testes and a pair of ovaries in their tail end, which are connected to two separate ducts. And they also determined that the ovaries are exclusively connected to the common oviduct, while the testes are exclusively connected to the other duct, known as the ductus ejaculatorius. Now, importantly, it is still unknown exactly how this spawning process occurs. As much as I would love to graphically describe in detail all of the different positions they use, how they tightly wrap their fins around each other, and how each fish takes turns inseminating the other, as much as I want to describe that to you, there is unfortunately no scientific evidence around to confirm these claims, and therefore it would all be purely speculative. However, it is certainly plausible that each fish does reciprocally take turns being the male or female, as this behavior has been observed in other fish. But keep in mind, it is also possible that these fish release their gametes into the water, and in that case, no physical contact would be required in the first place. So, hermaphrodism has a clear advantage. However, not all deep-sea fish in the ocean have evolved this way. For example, there is a type of anglerfish that has adopted a much different approach to sexual reproduction. Lophiiformes, also known as anglerfish, contain a suborder by the name of Ceratioidae. And for simplicity's sake, combined with the fact that I probably mispronounced that name, I will refer to them from here on as anglerfish. However, it is important to remember that contrary to what you may hear, the mating strategies of these fish are not representative of all anglerfish. But nonetheless, these fish have a very unique form of reproduction. The basic idea here is that the male will attach to the larger female, often permanently, and the female will take hold of the male and, more or less, use him as a sperm source. It is officially labeled as sexual parasitism. However, because the male does benefit in a way, and the female also does, one could argue it is also a form of mutualism. So how are these species evolved for this specific kind of reproduction? Well, there is a large sexual dimorphism between the males and the females. Relative to the females, the males are tiny. They can often be thousands of times smaller than the female mates. They are also much more numerous, and this is likely due to the fact that they're much easier prey, just due to their size. However, in order for these guys to find themselves a mate, they have adopted many specific traits that work very nicely with the traits of the females. Firstly, they are great swimmers, allowing them to travel far and wide in their quest to find female anglerfish. On top of that, they have well-developed sensory organs. Their eyes are large, and their olfactory organs within their nostrils, that is, the organs responsible for their sense of smell, are also very well developed. In fact, their olfactory glands are capable of smelling species-specific pheromones, which are basically distinct odors that can only be released by one of their own. Now, keep this in your head for a bit, because the adaptations that the male has make much more sense when they're contrasted to the characteristics that the female has developed. Now, the female anglerfish clearly appears much different than the males. First off, they are much larger, and in some cases up to 500,000 times larger than their male counterparts. They are also mostly sedentary, which basically means they don't move around very much, which, as I mentioned earlier, is often an adaptation to conserve energy, because food is really scarce in the deep sea. But arguably the most noticeable characteristic of these females is their luring apparatus, which is the long extension coming out of the top of her head, right over there. Now, this apparatus is bioluminescent, which basically means it can glow in the dark. So you may have been wondering from this, or on the last slide rather, why do males have such large eyes in an environment that has zero light? And the ultimate reason for their eyes is because it allows them to notice the glowing luring apparatus on the female. So to put it in perspective, if you're a male anglerfish, and you can detect even the slightest glimmer in the distance, it will make it much easier for you to find your beloved soulmate. And as time goes by, the male does indeed find his long-lost companion. But stop to look at this picture for a second. Doesn't the female look more like something the cute little male should stay the hell away from? I'm surprised the female doesn't accidentally confuse her date with her next meal. But what actually happens is the little guy ends up attaching to the body of his female companion. Often this occurs permanently, and in such cases, the tissues of both the male and the female will fuse together, resulting in an interconnected circulatory system. Now when you think about it, this is quite the commitment here. For many of us, it's scary enough just to share the same bank account with someone, let alone our bloodstream. But nonetheless, this is how anglerfish have adapted to the challenges of deep-sea sexual reproduction. And since the female now has access to the male's sperm source, she can now essentially become a self-fertilizing hermaphrodite, which leads me to the advantages of this adaptation. The greatest advantage of this permanent attachment is that in the dark, deserted deep sea, the female will now have access to a reliable sperm bank, which just so happens to be the little man sucking blood out of her back. But still, this is a wonderful scenario for her, as she doesn't have to worry about finding another mate during the next mating season. There is a slight disadvantage that the females must bear, and that is that to keep their male alive, they'll have to eat a little bit more food. However, because the males are so tiny compared to the females, this probably won't be a significant increase in energy needs. And because of the tight connection between these two fish, it allows for a very efficient allocation of sperm. Because when most organisms have sex, it often gets a little messy. Amongst most species, there are so many sperm cells that go to waste just because the two mating partners are not physiologically sealed to each other. And while this might be a good thing for those of us who prefer casual encounters without the consequences, this waste of sperm amounts to a very large loss of energy, which in a place such as the deep ocean, could lead a species to extinction. And importantly, because the sperm is used so effectively, the males don't have to be that large, and even the tiny amount of sperm that these little male anglerfish produce can be adequate to fertilize many eggs within the much larger female. But if there is a shortage of sperm, some anglerfish females actually have the ability to attach multiple males to themselves at once. In fact, some of them have even been seen to attach up to 8 at a time. So in essence, if the female feels one of these little fellas isn't enough to get the job done, then she has the option of allowing more in. And in that way, you'd further reduce the chance that sperm would be a limiting resource. So overall, it sounds like a great deal for the female. She's required to increase her energy intake a slight amount, but besides that, she benefits greatly. But what's in it for the male? The sound of being attached to a female might sound terrific initially, but in a lot of ways these fish end up becoming the female's man-slaves, who are basically forced to do nothing but supply sperm to them. However, there are some benefits to being a permanently attached male. Firstly, assuming that the female continues to eat, the male now has a consistent food source, which means that he does not have to go out searching for food because he has a continuous supply of it. And second, because the male anglerfish is so tiny, it ends up being very vulnerable to predation. As I mentioned earlier, this is probably why there are so many more males born in proportion to females. Anyways, being closely attached to the body of a big, often intimidating female anglerfish makes predation much less likely. The natural predators of the male anglerfish are often prey to the female anglerfish, so therefore it would not be wise for any of these predators to go near a female just to grab a quick snack. And lastly, for what it's worth, the males will be able to have sex whenever they want, reproduce, and continue their gene pool. So according to Darwinian theory, if you are surviving, feeding, and breeding, then you are the epitome of success. Now, besides the fish, there are many other organisms in the deep sea, many of which reproduce sexually. Among these is the squid, and although much of their reproductive behaviors in the deep sea are also unknown, scientists have recently used remotely operated vehicles in order to assess the squid of the deep ocean. In particular, the work of Hoving and Company has led us to believe that the deep sea squid reproductive strategies are much different than those of the shallow water squids. So one of the deep sea squid species observed is known as the Octopoteuthis deletron. It is a squid native to the eastern Pacific. And while it is considered a deep sea creature, it is also sometimes found in the mesopelagic zone. That is, the area slightly shallower and slightly brighter than the deep sea. And these critters are known to reproduce sexually by the males transferring sperm packages, known as spermatophores, onto the bodies of females. And these spermatophores are released through a long terminal organ, which you might as well call a penis. Now importantly, once these spermatophores are sent off onto the female, the spermatophores themselves release their own sperm masses, known as spermatangia. And this spermatangia is what attaches itself to the female's tissue, eventually allowing the female to become fertilized. Once the female is fertilized, the spermatangia can remain attached for a while, and as a result, it leaves noticeable bulbous white marks on the squid. As you can see in the picture here, these little white dots are all spermatangia deposits. So Hoving and Vicion used a remotely operated vehicle to explore the Octopoteuthis deletron species located at Monterey Submarine Canyon, which is just off the coast of California. And what they found is 39 identified adult squid, roughly half male, half female. And when they further observed these squid, they noticed that many of the females had spermatangia deposits, as one would expect. But surprisingly, just as many males were covered with the sperm. So this same-sex behavior, which could also be interpreted as homosexuality by some, is not a common occurrence among squids. These findings suggest once again that the deep sea environment has a major influence on mating strategies of the animals within it. However, one thing many could argue is that how do we know that the sperm is from another male? Now, as a male myself, I'm well aware that no matter how good you think your aim is, accidents can happen, and they can happen quite frequently. And if such accidents were to stick to my body for a long period of time, surely they'd be noticed often. Handshakes might get a little awkward. But my point is that in the case of the squid, how do we know that they aren't just shooting spermatangia onto themselves? Well, according to the analysis, there were deposits found in the males which were far away from their terminal organ. So even though it could be possible, it doesn't seem likely that all of these deposits can be accidents of the males onto themselves. What appears more likely is that the deposits are accidents of another male that happens to pass by them. And as I mentioned earlier, because the deep sea is dark, it's very hard to identify potential mates, even as they approach you. And also, incidentally, the male body structures of the squid species are relatively similar to the female overall body structure. So to sum it up, the male is basically emptying his ammunition on the first deletron squid he notices. And this is definitely an inefficient strategy. But when you consider the constraints of the deep dark ocean, the benefits seem to outweigh the costs in this situation. Now please be aware that, as compelling as this may be, there is still one major setback with the studies such as these, and that is that they only observed the aftermath of sexual activity, and they did not catch these creatures in the act. Because of this, it may be easy to challenge such findings. In the same year though, Hoving and his associates have reported a videotaped mating session between a pair of different deep-sea squid species known as the Pholidoteuthis adami. This was all recorded once again by a remotely operated vehicle, but this time within the Gulf of Mexico. Through the observations of this video, these scientists were able to determine the positioning between these two mating squids and describe it in detail. And it turns out to be a very unorthodox procedure. The male, being on top, has his head pointed in the opposite direction of the female. And to make things even more complicated, they are both facing away from each other during the act, adopting a back-to-back position in essence. Now in order to maintain this position, the male holds onto her tightly, and the female continues to swim around during the act, essentially hovering over the seafloor. And now with the position established between these two, here comes the good part. So the male's terminal organ or penis extends through the funnel on the front side of his body. There are, however, some big differences in how his penis is used in comparison to most animals we are familiar with. Firstly, the penis contacts the female's dorsal mantle, but it does not penetrate through anything. It also does not move during sex. It remains in one place. So try to imagine it as a fire hose full of sperm cells that sprays straight onto the female's body. The way the sperm is deposited from this point is the same way I described in the Octopoteuthis deleitron squids. However, unlike most of the other species I've mentioned earlier, this is the most difficult example when it comes to explaining why they mate in such a way. There does not seem to be any conclusive evidence that their style of mating is adaptive to the environment of the deep sea. So in conclusion, it's a whole new world when the lights go out, when you sink deeper into the dark abyss of our ocean. And even something as simple as sexual reproduction can become a challenge. However, many of the deep sea species have evolved in order to counter this obstacle, along with many more. And because they have been successful at it, they are still alive and thriving in the pitch blackness that we are just beginning to discover.